Good morning. This is Chewing the Gristle, a poetry chat with Al Black and my co-host, Tim Conroy. Welcome, Tim.
Hello, my brother Al.
Yes. And our poet today is Yehoshua November. Welcome, Yehoshua.
Thanks so much, Al and Tim, for having me. It's really a delight to be here.
Yehoshua November is the author of two poetry collections, God's Optimism, a finalist for the Los Angeles Times Book Prize in Poetry, and winner of the MSR Poetry Book Award, and his collection, Two Worlds Exist, a finalist for the National Jewish Book Award and the Patterson Poetry Prize. His work has been featured in the New York Times Magazine, Harvard Divinity Bulletin, The Sun, Virginia Quarterly Review, and on National Public Radio. He is also the winner of Prairie Schooner's Bernice Sloat Award and the London School of Jewish Studies Poetry Competition. November teaches writing at Rutgers University and Touro College. Welcome, Yehoshua.
Thanks so much. Thanks, Al and Tim. It's really a pleasure to be here.
Can you explain to us the origins of your poetry journey and those early poets and individuals who influenced your journey?
Sure. I would have to say that the very early seeds of poetry were probably planted when I was in my home, when my father would play music, and specifically a lot of the great singer-songwriters like Leonard Cohen and Bob Dylan, Simon and Garfunkel. And also, I just recall taking long family road trips and hearing that music, and it certainly left a deep impact. But even all other kinds of music as well, I think just gave me a kind of sense of the beautiful possibility of lyricism, Sam Cooke, Louis Armstrong. So I think that was really the beginning, the first seeds of seeing the beautiful possibilities of lyricism. Again, that was really, of course, mixed with music, but I remember, especially as a teenager, identifying with Bob Dylan. In fact, I have the same birthday as Bob Dylan, so I kind of I saw myself in that light, as a budding Bob Dylan. And he also, of course, is Jewish from Minnesota, and I lived in Minnesota when I was younger, and I even went to the same summer camp as him. So I think that was really the early seeds of poetry for me. And then later on, I think it came from really my family members themselves. My brother and sister are actually both poets. There's 4 siblings in the family. Only one is a social worker, and the other 3 are poets. So I have a sister, Dina, who lives in Pittsburgh, is a poet, and a brother, Baruch, who lives in Washington Heights in New York, Manhattan, and he's also a poet. And my grandmother wrote poetry, and I have one of her manuscripts of poems. And later, my grandfather wrote poetry. And my home was a traditional Jewish home, but one that was very much emphatic about the arts. And my mother was a student of art history. So I think that was a kind of like a backdrop that lent itself to being creative and artistic. I think, though, I really started writing poetry in earnest probably as a teenager. And I think that was really born out of a desire to just be understood by other people and to communicate with other people. And a lot of it was, the typical kind of teenage angst poetry, pseudo-existential crisis poetry that you would see from any teen. So I think that was really where I was coming from. When I was in college as an undergraduate student in Binghamton, I had a professor, Liz Rosenberg. She actually wrote the foreword to my first book, God's Optimism. And I remember her saying in class once that if she could articulate through the spoken word everything that she wanted to, she wouldn't need to turn to writing. But since the spoken word, conversation is not adequate to capture what poetry somehow magically does capture, she therefore did turn to poetry. And I think that's true. I think, especially when you're a young person and you feel alone and you want to connect to other people, it's almost as if through a poem you can share your entire core, your entire self with somebody else in such a kind of concentrated, compressed, acute way, which doesn't seem possible in any other kind of communication. So I always admired poetry for that, for the ability to really kind of transmit what's otherwise impossible to transmit. So that was really my origin in the very first kernel of or seeds of interest. And then, as I mentioned, I went off to college in Binghamton, and I studied under some really excellent professors there. One of my professors, her name is Mazziotti Gillan, who was a daughter of Italian immigrants, and she grew up in tenements in Paterson, New Jersey. And she writes a lot about the experience of trying to integrate into American life as a daughter of immigrants, and her initial shame, being not part of the majority group, and then kind of a lot of her poetry is about reclaiming her heritage and pride in her family life and celebrating her father's immigrant struggle. And she actually pushed me to write about my heritage, whereas I don't necessarily think I was trying to do that initially. I think, like a lot of young poets, I was trying to write universal poems that didn't connect to any particular time period or tradition. I remember wanting to kind of being dismissive of poems that were very specific and rooted in particular culture or time. I thought those will not last for infinity. Those are poems that are only going to be read in that time period, and then they're obsolete. So I was, like a lot of young people. In fact, then when I was in graduate school, I remember one of the jokes. I studied under the poet Tony Hoagland, who recently passed away in the last couple of years. And one of the jokes he would say is, and by now it's really outdated, he would always say, you need to put a toaster oven in your poem. You need a contemporary appliance, because you just want to write these poems that happened, centuries ago, in the old world, Russia, so you need to incorporate some elements, some props of contemporary daily life. So I think that those were some really helpful and good influences on me, and I think that the messages that they imparted really are things that I try to share with my students, namely, to try to write, obviously to try to use concrete details, use specifics, to understand and believe that small details from daily life can tell a much larger story than the details themselves. So, and I think also that part of my interest in literature and in poetry in particular was a kind of also against the backdrop of my traditional upbringing, where, in Jewish life, the texts are so central, and you spend so many hours unpacking the meaning of words, and every word has infinite possibilities, and every word is a universe, and every word there's a lot of consequence to every word. But I would say, on the other hand, at least initially, I kind of felt like poetry and literature allowed for a kind of immediacy and connection to the self that I didn't always feel in religion. In other words, religion was kind of something that I inherited, something ancestral, and something somewhat, superimposed, that I felt like, something, a tradition, and I believed in it, and I lived a traditional life, but it didn't speak to me with the kind of humanity and immediacy that literature did. So I kind of felt like it filled a certain void that I felt as a young person in my religious life. It kind of lent a kind of humanity and emotion and kind of tangibility that for whatever reason I didn't feel in my spiritual life. But then that kind of all that changed later, when I think I later started to favor spirituality for a period of my life, and moved away from literature. In fact, going on quite at length to answer one question, but when I finished my undergrad experience, which was in Binghamton, I got married. My wife was also a student in Binghamton University in upstate New York, and I went to an MFA program for poetry in University of Pittsburgh, and my wife studied social work there. And I, for whatever reason, the graduate school experience didn't feel as warm or as supportive as my undergraduate experience. And I think it's just the nature of being in graduate school. Maybe it's a little bit more competitive. Maybe people have bigger egos. I don't know. But I kind of felt that absence of the warmth that I felt when I was an undergrad. When I was an undergrad, some of my teachers even actually came to my wedding. They traveled down from Binghamton to New York to go to my wedding, and had a really strong rapport with my teachers. And then in graduate school, I just gotten married, and I was like entering a different kind of universe. For whatever reason, I kind of got, at that moment in my life, turned off to literary culture. And at the same moment, was my first exposure to, our first significant exposure to Hasidic life and to Hasidic teachings and Hasidic text, which is rooted largely in mysticism. And that kind of became much more intriguing to me than poetry in that moment. And I started to study that. And then ultimately I actually decided, when I finished my MFA in Pittsburgh, that I wanted to totally abandon literary life and literary culture. And I went to study with my wife. We had a child, a daughter. And we moved to Morristown, New Jersey, and I went to study in a Hasidic yeshiva there for 2 years. And I didn't write any poetry over those 2 years. I don't even know if I read any books in English in those 2 years. And then I found myself at another crossroads, because my wife was pregnant with our second child, and I had to earn a living some way. So the choice in front of me was to kind of continue to pursue Judaic studies and become a rabbi, or to try to go back to for some reason, I had this inclination to go back to try to teach in college and to continue to write poetry, which I hadn't been doing. But when, at the moment of truth, when I had to kind of make this decision at this crossroads, for some reason, poetry came back, and I felt like I wasn't being true to myself if I just gave all of that up. And interestingly, some of my mentors, my rabbis, actually said that, you really should probably pursue poetry and literature. Anybody could be a rabbi, or not anybody could be a rabbi, but certainly within the yeshiva, there are many rabbinic candidates in that world, at least. But there aren't that many poets writing out of the Jewish tradition and living a very, kind of Hasidic lifestyle. There are probably are only a handful or less Hasidic poets. And they said, if you have that gift, then that must be, for some kind of divine purpose, divine reason, and you really shouldn't just dismiss it so readily. So that was the advice that even some of my rabbis gave me, and I think it also stems out of the particular Hasidic school of thought that I am connected with. And the central theology, the central tenet of that school of thought is this idea that God created the world, the heavens, and all of the intervening spiritual worlds only for the sake of this lowest world. And he wanted, what's in the Midrash, the phrasing is that he wanted a dwelling place, a home in the lowest realm, in the physical world. And that's achieved through humanity being kind of like God's ambassador and engaging with the physical in noble or spiritual ways, and kind of making the physical world, the material world, a home for God. So they said, if that's the case, you shouldn't necessarily be so quick to try to sequester yourself and leave the world and leave the university and leave secular life, but maybe you can infuse secular life with a kind of spirituality.
But I'd love the listeners to hear a couple of your poems, and I think that will help them put your responses in context too.
Okay, sure. Are there any particular poems that you would like me to read? Or?
Well, I loved, the poetry in God's optimism. Your book is so strong, so powerful, so grounded with ordinary imagery. Any of those poems. Also, the man with the that didn't grow up, wasn't raised.
Oh, the tattoos. Okay, yeah, okay.
Tattoo is a great poem. So
that's my greatest hit as a poet.
Oh, that's a wonderful poem.
Read that. That's a poem called Baal Tshuva at the mikveh. A Baal Tshuva is a person who didn't grow up within a Jewish religious framework and adopted that lifestyle later on. And in Jewish tradition, a person is not supposed to have a tattoo. So you have these men who didn't grow up within the Jewish fold, the religious fold, and they embrace that life later, and they have tattoos from before they started to live a traditional life. And the scene is at the mikveh. A mikveh is a ritual bath. And in Hasidic culture in particular, men immerse in the ritual bath before morning prayers. So you have a scene where you have all these men, really kind of like a men's locker room. And they're, but some of the men are grew up within the religious fold, and some of them are newcomers. So they have kind of the remnants of their past life, such as tattoos. So it's called Baal Tshuva at the mikveh. Sometimes you see them in the dressing area of the ritual bath, young bearded men unbuttoning their white shirts, slipping out of their black trousers, until, standing entirely naked, they are betrayed by the tattoos of their past life. A ring of fire climbing up a leg, an eagle whose feathery wingspan spreads the width of the chest, or worse, the scripted name of a woman other than one's wife. Then, holding only a towel, they begin once more the walk past the others in the dressing room. The rabbi they will soon sit before in Talmud class, men with the last names of the first Hasidic families, almost everyone devout since birth. And with each step, they curse the poverty that keeps the dark ink etched in their skin, until finally they descend the stairs of the purifying water, and beneath the translucent liquid appear once again like the next man, who, in all his days, has probably never made a sacrifice as endearing to God.
Yeah, that's a unbelievable, powerful ending. It's just a beautiful poem. How about another one?
Another one? Okay, sure. You have another pick from the book?
I love cleaning out Zadie's apartment.
Oh, okay, excellent. Okay, great. I'll read that. And I'm happy to read that, especially this week, because on this Friday, I believe, is actually the anniversary of both of my grandparents passing. In Yiddish, it's called Yartzeit, which means a year's time. So both of them actually passed away on the same day, but 8 years apart. And so we always felt like they have a very profound connection, that they would actually die on the same Hebrew day of the calendar. So it's called Cleaning Out Zeta's Apartment. And the last line of the poem is actually just a note that my grandmother had written to my grandfather that I found. So that's the very last line. It's about hard-boiled eggs. So it's called Cleaning Out Zeta's Apartment. And Zeta, of course, is a grandfather in Yiddish. It's for my grandparents. His scent still lingered in the black heat of his dark room, where he spent decades developing his meticulous world of insects and flowers. Boxes of slides lay piled on top of one another. Holding one to the lamplight, I entered a different universe, where moths silently cling to the stems of roses. In the bedroom, we found tie clips in the shape of airplanes, and then the slender, fragile model planes he had built from scratch and hand-painted, bright blue with yellow emblems on the wings. And in every drawer, countless notes she had written to him. He must have saved them all, each one wedding the mundane to a private world only the lovers themselves could know. Hard-boiled eggs on the stove. I believe in you.
That's great. That's fabulous. Describe your poetry style. How would you describe it to the listener?
I think that it's one of the qualities that is often used to label my poetry is accessible. I was fortunate, one time that I had a poem in the New York Times Sunday magazine, and Matthew Zapruder was the poet who was selecting the poems at that time, and I was intrigued by the description that he gave of my poetry. He said it's poetry of radical clarity, which was I was not surprised to be called radical within the very secular poetry world, but I didn't think I would be called radical because of the clarity of my poetry. so that was really interesting to see him call the poetry radical clarity. And I'm definitely aware that my poetry is extremely accessible. I didn't necessarily think of that it relative to others, it's radically clear. But maybe that's true. I mean, to some extent, at least.
There is an emphasis, right, on every small detail in your poetry, in how that illuminates our daily lives. Those details, the ordinary details.
Right.
In that sense, I kind of get what he's saying.
Yeah, but I guess there's not that much to unpack necessarily. I mean, maybe when you read it, it will cause you to think about things, hopefully. Hopefully it will resonate and there'll be like an afterglow and a person will think, you hope a person will think about your poems and they'll stay with the person. But they definitely do not beg interpretation, I don't think. I think that the meaning of the poem is on the surface of the page, which is not necessarily true of other poets. One of my friends is a poet. He's another Orthodox Jew. His name is David Kaplan, and I share my poetry with him. He's a poetry professor at Ohio Wesleyan. He actually, parenthetically, wrote a book about contemporary rap artists and how perhaps their use of form demonstrates more virtuosity than a lot of contemporary poets. He wrote a whole kind of study. He studied, the poetics of rap music. Interesting book. But his poetry is very elliptical, and so when I share my poems with him, a lot of times he said, "Oh, wow, you're just giving everything away. Why don't you withhold something?" and it leaves some things to be a mystery. So yeah, I don't know. I maybe it also comes from learning in yeshiva, and in yeshiva, you're trying to ultimately, let's say you're learning a passage of the Talmud, and you're trying to get to an ultimate resolution, into ultimate clarity, and clarity is so important. So maybe that somehow came to bear on my own poems. I don't know. I think that the emphasis on the concrete and the particular is a good point, is a good observation. But I think that also probably comes, at least in part, from some theology as well. Like I was mentioning, that in the Hasidic school of thought, the purpose of existence is to create a home for God in the world, and the idea is really that each item in the world has a kind of intrinsic or inherent holiness, and it's up to the individual to kind of reveal that and expose it. So in that sense, I think there's a lot of overlap, although you wouldn't think to say it, but there's a lot of overlap between Hasidic thought and contemporary poetry, in that Hasidic thought is saying that the lowest realm, the physical, the mundane, is actually God's true home. There's something mysterious and holy about the ordinary, which is definitely something that echoes in poetry. Poetry, a lot of contemporary poetry, seems to be about finding the wondrousness in the ordinary, the magnificence in the quotidian. So I think that my religious life or my spiritual life reinforces some of these practices in my poetry of focusing on the image in the concrete detail, in the particular.
Yeah, I think you're right. Brother Al.
Well, here's a subject that many folks struggle with.
Yeah.
How much time do you spend on revision, and is a poem ever really finished?
That's a good question. I don't have any rules. Although in class sometimes I'll try to impart certain successful practices, but I really don't have any rules about revision or writing any particular poem. And the reason is, I think, because each poem is so different, that I find I would say some poems that I write come to me in an almost complete fashion, and I'll sit down and write the poem, and it really won't take that much revision. And a lot of times those are the poems that I'm actually most satisfied with. Like, for example, that poem about the tattoos, the man with the tattoos, that poem didn't really require very much revision. Maybe a little tinkering, but not too much. And I think what happened in writing a poem like that was that I actually saw that image of the man with the tattoos, and it really, resonated, and it kind of was a really memorable moment, and kind of strange and interesting thing to see, and a very human moment. Like, I thought, how perhaps they felt certain shame. So it was really a very resonant moment. And I remember when I saw that, I was like thinking that definitely I'll write a poem about this. And I didn't write that poem right away, right up the day that I saw that image. Maybe it kind of cooks inside of you for some time. And then when I did finally feel an overwhelming urge to sit down and write it, I kind of had to sit down and write it at that moment. I knew it was ready. I sat down and wrote it, and it was pretty much, again, complete in one writing. And again, that is a poem that I'm pretty happy with, satisfied with. And I just had to kind of sense that it's finished. Then there's other poems, that I've been working on for years. And those poems, I mean, I'm just in the midst of some of them are like, and I feel like kind of like that's like a poem, you can't put a time limit on it, because you just have to get it right. I feel like it's not right. I know it's not right. And sometimes I would say part of it comes out right, And that's kind of similar to the other experience that I spoke about, where, you write in the first draft, a large portion of the poem could come out, right? But then you might, let's say, get stuck in the ending and you just kind of working on it. Sometimes a solution is to just take another part of another failed poem that kind of is on the same theme, or that would just be a kind of interesting or unusual way to end the poem. But I really don't have any rules. I think that it's very important to have a friend that's writing, or a teacher, to look at the poems as well, because as anybody who's writing poetry knows, it's so hard to write a good poem. And since it's so hard to write a good poem, it's so easy to convince yourself that you are doing so, that your poem is good, so it's important to have somebody else take a look at your poetry. And of course, especially when you're starting to write, you might think to yourself, well, poetry is, the gushing of the human heart. It's my personal story. What could somebody else have to say about, the way I'm doing things? It's my poem. But a lot of times, we want to say something, and there's something we really want to do, but there's an audience, and the question is, is the audience getting what we're trying to impart? And sometimes a friend could see what you're trying to do, but you're not really being successful at. So it's just like any other kind of practice or discipline. It's good to have a mentor. It's good to have somebody who's objective, looking at your work. And again, I think it's especially so with poetry, because a lot of poetry is very personal. So you're really kind of steeped inside of the emotion that you might be writing about. And even if it's not, you want so badly to write a good poem, and it's so hard to do it, that it's so easy to tell yourself you are. And sometimes I even have this experience where I spend a long time in a poem, and I show it to my friend, and he says, "Oh, this is not working here." And I'm like, at first, I'm like, he's wrong. It is working. And then maybe a couple months later, I'll realize that he was right and I was wrong, because I'm still too close to it. But I will say that when I have a kind of poem that writes itself in one sitting, that I'm really satisfied with, a lot of times those do end up holding up. But another point is that I think maybe there's a couple kinds of poems that I'm writing. Also, a lot of poems, the best poems are the ones that I'm most satisfied with, come from an image. I'll see an image, and that image will guide the poem pretty much all the way through. And then there's other poems where you kind of stop and start, and they stall out, and you're trying to get the phrasing right and working on some of those nuances. That almost feels like you're manufacturing a poem, as opposed to the poem just working through you. You have to use whatever skills or tricks you've accumulated, but it doesn't feel as natural or as right. And I guess if you really worked on those poems for a long time, they would be come out polished, but there's something lacking, at least to me, in the mystery and the energy of those poems when compared to these other more imagistic poems.
Okay. Would you share a couple more poems with us? And one's maybe whatever your favorites are, but this idea of illumination and mystery, for me, as a religious person, is very intriguing to me.
Okay, maybe I'll actually read some new poems that I haven't published even, or that I haven't read. I'll read another poem about my grandfather, actually, again, because it's and my grandmother, it's their anniversary of their passing is coming up this week. So this is called Zeta Sydney. It's about my grandfather. And I don't think I ever even read this in public before. So I hope I don't embarrass myself. All right. So it's called Zeta Sydney. Ow, you beamed me, he howled, hopping on one foot in our backyard to shake off the pain of my pitch. How stately his tall frame as he assumed a batter's stance at 75 in his signature brown pants and yellow shirt. He laughed high-pitched at jokes on TV, in the autographs he forged on our baseball cards. When we'd stay in his small Brooklyn apartment, half the square footage taken by his dark room, I'd sleep between him and my grandmother, a short woman who battled her own Russian sadness but supported him ceaselessly. His long arm draped over my small frame, I turned to spy under folding chair nightstand, bottles of whiskey and vodka, comic books, a journal filled with her poems. When the principal of our yeshiva boarding school in Rochester left town for his son's wedding, my friends and I escaped to New York and landed in Zeta's apartment. We returned from a movie, pizza, ice cream floats, to listen to my father's reprimand on the answering machine. Zeta's laugh, equally uproarious with each replaying. He brought us to his dark room, projected a midnight slideshow of bright yellow bees nestling on green stems, monarch butterflies opening white-tipped wings against purple hydrangeas. Each image touched up until the world appeared the way he saw it.
Wonderful.
Thank you. It's always a big risk reading a new poem, you know.
But risk is what poetry is.
Yeah. For some reason, I thought it would be a good idea today to read some new ones. Should I try another one? And I'll read another new one.
Please.
Okay. This is called And I Knew Everything Would Remain Ordinary. Each morning before sunrise, I reviewed the mystical discourse on divine providence. The slightest movement of each blade of grass fulfills the divine intent of creation as a whole. After teaching the last course of the day, I watched geese ascend from the river behind the crumbling tennis court, chanting life is meaningless. One day, in the middle of my years, I sat in a boardroom's plush chair, the green eyes of the man opposite me sparkling as he outlined an offer not generous enough to change my life. And on my walk to the edge of the parking lot, I heard a car door slam in the distance and recalled your face, which I had dreamt of the whole first year of college, when you did not hold my hand on the grassy hill behind the dorms, but then, inexplicably, the next fall, began to trace your toe around my shoelace.
Your poems are working. They need to be published.
All right. So, yeah. Got to tell that to the editors.
Yeah.
The big editors, the big places.
Tim.
So I'm going to ask for the emerging poet, do you have any resources or craft books that have helped your practices?
A book that I found to be pretty useful is called In the Palm of Your Hand. I use it in my Intro to Creative Writing course. But a lot of times what I just try to do is kind of create my own packet for my students, especially in like an intro class, a packet of highly accessible poetry. So I'll try to like put a lot of Sharon Olds poetry in that packet. Students respond well to her work. And one of my teachers I mentioned, Maria Gillan, who really is emphatic about narrative clarity. And she, one of the really great things about her as a teacher is she kind of just really try to underscore not to worry about producing something great, not to really put these great expectations on your shoulders, and just write. And you see in her own writing, she's just so unpretentious and free about what she's writing. And often it just pays off because she's not really putting too much pressure on herself, and she's able to get to these places of deep emotion and deep discovery because she's just not pressuring herself. And by the same token, I a lot of times will try in my own classes to give prompts that are somewhat absurd or ridiculous. Like, for example, on one of the early classes, I have them write a piece. It was just impromptu. In the dream, my father reprimanded me for wearing earmuffs indoors. And then I think, in the face of a prompt like that, the student doesn't feel like they have to write a literary masterpiece because it's just kind of silly. And then surprisingly, they're able to actually do some really innovative, original things because they don't have that pressure. So I think that's like, one of the most important things. And everybody succumbs to it. I mean, I think now, like, I'm trying to write, I have to come up with another book. I need enough poems to make another book. And then that kind of pressure just derails me. And I just, the poetry is so forced. But if I just, sit down with my notebook and write and not really worry about, the audience at all even, and just, write what's interesting to me or what's coming to me and not think about publishing, then, you get to some really, you get to an interesting place within the self, place of discovery, and really fresh and kind of original and interesting. That just doesn't happen when you're trying to force things. So I think that's the most important advice I would say to, or at least one piece of important advice is not to put too much pressure on yourself and not to think that, literary work has to be this kind of elite, abstract, inaccessible kind of work. It can just be, speaking, directly. And then you'll see, even when you're just writing very directly, you'll get to places that are very interesting.
How can people get hold of your collections?
You can go to the best thing is probably if you go to the publishers' websites themselves. The first book is Main Street Rag, that was produced by Main Street Rag, God's Optimism. And the second book is called Two Worlds Exist. That was published by Horizon Press, which is a press that's in North Carolina, and they're doing a lot of work on like kind of spiritual poetry, but very broadly defined, not necessarily tied to any particular religion, just a kind of spiritual, maybe in the sense of like discovery and mystery, that kind of spirituality. So I would go to those websites. If you go to my website, also you could get links to those presses. Or if you have to, you could go to Amazon.
Can you read two last poems for us?
Sure. Yeah, let me read. I'll read one very short one, very, very short, new. It's called Like One Walking to the Supply Room. Like one walking to the supply room for a paperclip, but pausing beneath the doorframe, a soul descends into a body and cannot remember why. Okay, one last one. I talked about poems that are kind of like born out of images. So this is also one that was really born out of really actually a couple striking images. And this one too was written, I would say, largely in one sitting. It's called You Stood Beneath a Streetlight Waving Goodbye. You stood beneath a streetlight waving goodbye the night we dropped you off in the city for our daughter's appointment with one of the country's top surgeons. And as we drove away, the other children and I waved back at you until, because of the angle and the distance, your forms disappeared in the light. And I remembered how, in college, I would turn back each evening as I stepped out of your apartment building. You would poke your young, beautiful face out the second-story window, your arm cutting the cool night air as you waved goodbye. And I would walk backwards over the frosted grass until I reached halfway beyond the next building, where each time, from that distance, I watched the street lamp's light suddenly consume your dark arm and face. The mystics say creation begins as a luminescent point, a flash of wisdom containing all that will be, but in an abstract, potential form. All those nights when we were so young, when your body became a ray of light, I could not have imagined the life that lay ahead of us a decade later. 2 boys and 2 girls, one who cannot hear. All of us in a small apartment, each with needs as enormous as mansions. Sometimes I'm afraid you will wave goodbye and turn away from our life together. That a man who can make things easier has been waiting ever since the mystic's luminescent flash, growing ever more real and hungry for you, until one day he will materialize as you load groceries into the van. I would like to go back to the young woman waving at the window to the man walking backwards. I would like to show her this life, to say she is free to go, and to ask her if she will still take me.
We want to thank our poet, Yehoshua November. We encourage you to investigate his books, go to his website.
Thanks so much, Tim and Al. It was really a great pleasure. I really enjoyed the conversation. Thanks so much.